with the today we've seen the news breaking about the police officer, I think it's in Croydon, who got murdered, basically shot and murdered. So what's your view on that? Because that's definitely relevant to what we've been discussing. I mean, obviously it's a terrible event, but do you think that's relevant to the broader narrative?
I think so, Max. So, I mean, I would say that one of the most worrying features of 2020 is the normalisation of violence and intimidation towards British police officers, especially in London. So there was data that recently came out which showed that under lockdown, assaults on police officers in London had risen by 40%. During this, what I'd say amid the wave of Black Lives Matter demonstrations and protests, I do think there has been a peddling of aggressively anti-police narratives, which are not rooted in reality. And we've discussed this before earlier on in our conversation. So what I will say is that all too often there's been a spectacularly relaxed attitude towards these rising forms of violence towards police officers. And their superiors have encouraged police officers to indulge in these virtue signalling initiatives, taking the knee, this sort of rainbow flag related initiatives as well. Okay, fine, but your bread and butter, your focus should be on making sure that your police officers are as well protected as possible. And if you do see data which shows that they're suffering rising forms of violence being shown towards them, then that clearly shows that there's a problem in terms of police officers and police forces commanding a level of respect and authority which allows them to carry out their duties in an effective way. The reality matters if police forces and police officers are seen as increasingly being seen as a soft touch, that's going to encourage people to be disrespectful towards them. And in the worst cases, it's going to encourage people to be intimidating towards them and be violent towards police officers as well. When I was talking about the increase in assaults, that includes police officers being spat on and coughed at during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is very serious. There's very serious developments. And if I make one point, I think the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan in particular, has been spectacularly relaxed on these kind of issues. He's hung his own police officers out to dry. And so when I see him say, I'm devastated to hear the news, okay. Most people consider what happened in Croydon to be devastating news. But where were you when this data was coming out that your own police officers were suffering these rising forms of violence being shown towards them? So I think it's time for politicians to develop a backbone and push back on aggressively anti-police messaging, which is not rooted in reality. And they also need to understand that if there's a vilification of the police that they're indulging in, that is going to have an impact on how people perceive the police and and it will have an influence on how they behave towards them.